TGC. In today's discussion, we will talk about China. We will try to understand this complex dynamics that can China become credible mediator between Israel and Palestine. So for this, we have joined by Dr. Guy Burton, who is a prominent expert in the politics of Middle East, especially when it comes to China's economic and political interest. First of all, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
I will start from the very basic argument. Everyone is talking about China's, recent reconciliation between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Do you think that blueprint can work for Gaza? The same model can work for Gaza?
Not really, because look, I think it's important to not overstate China's involvement in the Saudi Iranian normalization. And it's not really a peace agreement either. It was merely just a reconstitution of diplomatic relations between the two sides, which had effectively been broken since the 2016, so we've had, what you have really is when you look at the Iran-Saudi agreements, the Chinese hosted those talks, but in many ways it was already going to happen because talks were already taking place between Iran and Saudi Arabia through other channels, initially Oman and then subsequently Iraq, even before they reached the talks in Beijing. So there was already an impetus, a drive to reach an agreement between these two sides. So it's not that China itself instigated those talks. It's not that China was a major mediator. And in fact, some people talked about what role does China have in terms of being a security guarantor for these two sides. The fact is there wasn't anything there. And also, we're not talking about resolving a conflict, a war. We're talking about just bringing the two sides back to the table to recognize each other, to restart diplomatic relations. So I think when you're comparing that to a hot war that we see in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, it's very hard to see how you would map that Iranian-Saudi agreement, onto Gaza. So I'm somewhat skeptical that you can take the Chinese approach and say that they are now a major conflict mediator in the region. I think that's questionable.
Yeah, you are saying the dynamics between Saudi Arabia and Iran are different from Gaza and Israel. What do you think China's involvement in this reconciliation? Do you think it's motivated by its broader geopolitical rivalry with the US?
Well, look, the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement also happened alongside a broader recognition in the Arab Gulf that they needed to reconcile with Iran, or at least some actors in the Gulf needed to reconcile with Iran. And this was already taking place in the last couple of years. If you think about, I think really what's important is to look at the wider context of what's been happening over the last decade or so. If you recall the first Trump administration, which took place between 2017 and the end of 2020, there was a moment back in September 2019 when Saudi oil installations at Al Abqaiq were attacked. And the expectation that America would come to its defense as the regional Gulf security provider didn't happen. And I think that sent a lot of shockwaves through Gulf capitals at the time, that the Americans were not the kind of reliable partner that they had before, that they were going to have to start to deal with their regional problems themselves. So what you saw was actually the resolution of the rivalry that had been taking place between the Saudis and the Emiratis on one side and Qatar on the other. If you recall, there was that conflict, that tension where Qatar was effectively diplomatically and economically blockaded by the two bigger Gulf states. They reconciled towards the end of 2020, beginning of 21. And it's also around that time that there was a realization that, look, Iran is a regional rival. We're going to have to deal with them as well. So there was an and we're going to have to deal with it on our own terms. We're going to have to go beyond, reliance on our external partners like the Americans. And I think that is where you start to see the shift taking place within the region. And so hence why I said, I come back to the point I made earlier about China. China really came in on the tail of that. They weren't at the forefront of it. They weren't leading any kind of negotiations and talks between them. This was an initiative that came from the Gulf itself.
So what China is bringing on the table, which is not like China is saying we will bring something. China is always telling to the world we are alternative to the Western, mediators. What China is bringing, which is not available with Western mediators, especially when it comes to international institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. So, it does make so when you're looking at China in the Middle East, which is the area I know best, it's worth keeping in mind that China does look at the region through several different lenses. So, for the first, most of China's relations with the region is, country by country. It deals specifically with the government there. It doesn't really have a depth of a relationship with wider civil society. It doesn't really do that. Its primary relations is, states to state. But then you've also got to factor that this is a complicated region. This is not a place where the place is at peace, as we've seen. There are rivalries, there are confrontations. In some cases, there are hot wars going on. And so what you have is that Beijing does try and look at a regional level what is happening, and so has to engage with the region at this kind of broader level. And that's also tied in with where the Middle East sits in the wider geopolitical space. And of course, what we've seen over the last decade is an increasing confrontation and tension between the Americans on one side and the Chinese on the other. So you have this emerging Cold War 2.0, if you want to call it that. And so as a result, Beijing does look at the Middle East through the existence of these regional rivalries, say between the Arab world and Israel and Iran, but also through America's presence there and America's competition with China. So the Chinese see the region as a space in which to counter and challenge American rivalry. So in this sense, China's attempt to present itself as a conflict mediator is a way of saying, look, the Americans have supposedly been until now the principal hegemonic power here. But look, the region is chaotic. By contrast, look at us. We can present an alternative to the United States. Join us. Now, whether that's really more than rhetorical is open to discussion. Really, what the Chinese have been trying to do is to portray themselves as a counterweight to the Americans, and so they're seeing these conflicts and these rivalries as an opportunity. So,
how much this narrative is credible? If there is a gap created by the United States of America, so at the one end, China is saying we can fill this gap, and promoting this narrative. How much this narrative is credible? Is it true that the US has failed to reconcile between Israel and Palestine?
Well, so I mean, this does open up some interesting points of discussion, because if you take the Israel-Palestine conflict, this is one where, I mean, China, like most other actors, has pretty much accepted the principle of the Oslo process, which is to all intents dead and buried. But the idea of Oslo has been for the last 30 years that the Israelis and Palestinians have to negotiate, and then in exchange for land there will be peace. So the Palestinians will get a state, the Israelis will get security. And who is the principal third-party mediator in all of this? The United States. Right? And the United States has been pretty protective of its involvement in that process. It doesn't really want to open it up to anybody else. And similarly, actually, the Israelis, who are currently doing quite well relative to the Palestinians, they too also don't want to open up that process, because, of course, they have the ear of the Americans in a way that the Palestinians don't have, and in a way that if you did bring other third parties in, Israel would not have that degree of influence. So when you take the Israel-Palestinian conflict, it is one that's pretty closed, pretty much dominated by the Americans. However, if you then look at the Gulf and the relationship between the Arab Gulf states and Iran, that is an interesting one because, of course, the Americans have no real they don't have any direct contact with the Iranians. And although they are partners of the Arab Gulf states, just as the Chinese are, the Chinese in some respects do have the ability to be able to speak to both sides, right? And I think if you go back to the JCPOA talks on Iran's nuclear program back in 2013 to 15, when that agreement was reached, in many ways, the Chinese, because it was actually the permanent UN Security Council 5, so Britain, France, America, Russia, and China, as well as Germany, those were the principal parties to the JCPOA. For the Western countries, it was quite difficult for them to persuade the Iranians that they could be trusted, right? And that's where China became a really important player because it had ties and connections and links to the Iranians, as well as to the West. And in that sense, China was able to play the middleman in the terms of with regards to actually getting the Iranians on one side and the West on the other closer together. So certainly in that respect, the Chinese did have a role to play, but that was a very different kind of setup to the one that we have with the Oslo process between Israel and the Palestinians. Now, maybe the Chinese think that if we were to open up the Israeli-Palestinian process to other parties like ourselves, then we would be able to make a play for them, to provide some opportunity there. The difficulty, of course, for the Chinese when it comes to Israel and Palestine is that, particularly in the wake of this current war, China is not trusted by the Israelis. The immediate response of Beijing to the October 7th attacks last year was not to condemn the attacks that Hamas had taken and also to criticize implicitly Israel's decision to escalate. And that was recognized very quickly by the Israelis, who effectively have not trusted the Chinese since and would never accept the idea of expanding the peace talks to include the Chinese. So maybe this is also why the Chinese started to recognize that they couldn't play any sort of principal role between Israel and the Palestinians. But what they could do was to maybe try and facilitate conversations within the Palestinian side. And hence why you've seen the Chinese hosting these national unity talks between Fatah and Hamas, the two principal factions, as well as others. And we did see an agreement reached, at least in principle, back in July. Now, maybe this is the Chinese idea of playing the long game here, that if the Palestinians can be brought together, that potentially they could then be behind the Palestinians when it comes to talks between Israel and the Palestinians. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Chinese would be there presently in terms of mediating between Israel and the Palestinians. But I think what they're trying to do is to say, look, if we are serious about this mediating role, we're not going to be able to do it by replacing the United States between Israel and the Palestinians. But maybe what we can do is to facilitate the Palestinian side towards unity.
Okay. You said Israel, there is some trust deficit between Israel and China. Do you think China can leverage its economic ties with Israel? As we know, the trade between Israel and China, it's very high. What do you think about this? If China leverage these ties to, de-escalate the conflict?
Well, so it's worth keeping in mind that the high point of Israel-China trade and investments has really passed. So it was the case about a decade ago that China was becoming an increasingly important market for Israeli goods and services, particularly in the high-tech sector, right? But and certainly China was investing a lot into some of these high technology sectors and firms in Israel back about 10 years or so ago, as well as investing in places which obviously caught a lot of attention, the Haifa port, around infrastructure development. But then what you saw was, particularly under the first Trump administration, you started to see the Americans waking up and realizing that in their confrontation with China, that Israel was a key party here, and you started to see pressure from the Americans toward being placed on the Israelis to hold on a minute here, take a step back, because if you start to allow the Chinese to invest into places like key infrastructure like the Haifa port where the American fleet docks, or allow the Chinese into your telecommunications sector, that exposes you and makes you vulnerable. And the Americans started to put pressure on Israel that you need to make a choice. And really, this actually did happen. So back in about 2019, the then government, still run by Netanyahu at the time, but effectively accepted this and said that for future investments, we are now going to have an advisory committee that reviews the foreign ownership of any potential contracts. So what you had already started to see, even before COVID happened, you were starting to see a leveling off and a decline in Chinese investment decisions in Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that it's completely disappeared, but it's certainly, sort of that the high point of Sino-Israeli economic exchange is probably passed. Now, you do ask the question, like, could the Chinese have used their economic leverage within the country to push? Of course, that's a possibility, but they never did. And I guess there's also, to some extent, this also reflects the way that the Chinese have approached the region, which is it is still a predominantly economic relationship. Yes, increasingly they have become more involved in the politics of the region, but in many ways it's a reaction rather than a proactive stance. And often this is more the consequence of other decisions being made. I mean, let's be honest with you, that the Americans have presented the China as a challenge and a threat in the region, but it's important to keep in mind the relative size, both economically as well as diplomatically as well as militarily. The Chinese are still a second-order actor when it comes to a presence in the Middle East. It is not a peer-to-peer competitor with the United States in any sense. So, if you were to talk about China being able to impose itself on the Middle East, it actually doesn't have that much scope to be able to do so.
You just said the US has, mentioned that China is a threat in the region. On what factors on the basis they are saying this? China is a threat in the Middle East.
In a number of different ways. So, I mean, there's been some talk about, I remember about 6 or 7 years ago, when China was took a lot of its kind of Belt and Road infrastructure development. If you look at the construction of the port at Djibouti, that now does have a sort of a Chinese military presence there. But let's keep in mind, it's only a small military presence compared to, America's military presence, which is across the Middle East and in a number of different countries. I think, there is this sense of, China's investments, maybe have a dual purpose, a dual edge to it, that yes, it may be sort of ostensibly civilian, but it could be sort of turned militarily quite quickly. So if you go back and take, for example, we were just talking about Iran's nuclear program. It is, according to the Iranians, it is a civilian nuclear program, right? And in fact, the Chinese did support that program back in the 1980s and 1990s. But as it became more, people became more suspicious that actually the Iranians were looking to break out from civilian to military use of that nuclear program. This is when you see the Chinese pulling out, because there is no interest in Beijing in seeing nuclear proliferation. They're signed up to the non-nuclear proliferation pact, and they want to limit the number of nuclear weapons. So in that respect, there is actually overlapping interest with the West in that regard. And I think there's also that sense of, Chinese interests do vary across the region. So if you take, it has initially been motivated by, access to regular and reliable hydrocarbons, whether it's oil or gas, and it's got to be, so that obviously makes it pay close attention to the Gulf. But increasingly as well, it's become more interested in high tech, and sort of, more high value added investments and trade as well. So hence why you have had a lot more interaction between Chinese firms and firms in the Gulf, whether it's to do with renewable energies, whether it's to do with electric vehicles, whether it's to do with real estate, whether it's to do with health, and other services. So what you're seeing is this kind of expansion and diversification of economic activity by the Chinese in the region. But of course, a lot of this is motivated by economic activity, economic interest. The thing is, as I come back to, I reiterate the point I made before, you enter into things economically, but then it is not a region that is particularly stable. And so there is always the risk of rivalries and confrontation. And that forces the Beijing to take more of a political interest in the region, because of course those business interests are threatened if the place becomes unstable.
Yeah, I was coming to this question. On 7th October 2023, the conflict was just between two parties, Israel and Hamas, but unfortunately it extended to Iran and other non-state actors, and especially now Syria, Lebanon, these countries. What do you think this unstable Middle East, how much China is disturbed when it comes to its global ambitions such as BRI?
Yeah, and that's, I think, and I think it's worth keeping in mind that in some ways China's interests in the region do reflect the extent to which a particular country is considered to be high risk or low risk. So actually, often, and I think mistakenly, some people have seen China and Iran as very much in cahoots with each other, as two allies. And I think that's actually debatable. That's questionable. Certainly the Chinese have been supportive of the Iranian regime, but they don't see them as their primary partner in the region. In fact, they probably see the Arab Gulf countries, and particularly the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as more important, because of course they are more there's the quality of the economic exchange is much higher. These are also, but it's also it's also relevant that these places are also less politically unstable domestically. So whereas what you have in Iran is you've got a very weak economy. It's buffeted by sanctions. While yes, the regime is in power, there is sort of a latent frustration with it. So despite the fact that around 3-4 years ago, the Iranians and the Chinese inked a memorandum of understanding, we've not really seen any substantial investments made by the Chinese into Iran. Similarly, you talked about Syria as well. There was some discussion, particularly until quite recently, the conflict was frozen in Syria. And there was some discussion about, is this, and with Syria now being accepted back into the Arab League and relations being normalized with the Assad regime back in Damascus, is this now the time that Syria will start to rebuild and reconstruct? You certainly saw Damascus making it clear that it wanted Chinese investment, Chinese partnership in order to bring in the kind of capital that it's going to need to rebuild. The Chinese pretty much allowed themselves to be photographed and spoken to and met with Assad, but they've not done anything since. And that probably reflects the fact that there really is still far too much of a high risk for many of these firms, not just private ones, but also state firms as well, to do any kind of significant business there. So I think when you look at the region, it's important to keep in mind that it's not, you can't see Chinese influence and the China footprint in the Middle East as uniform. It really is stronger and deeper in those places which are considered to be low risk and almost non-existent where it's high risk.
So what are the stumbling blocks to China they are facing in order to resolve this conflict? And there is another question which is linked to this. Do you think like some people they believe or they say China and Iran they are in cohorts with each other? How much this element is also a hindrance between this in resolving to this conflict, because at the end of the day Israel will think China is supporting one party. There is some asymmetry. When there is asymmetry, so the mediations cannot be successful.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you take what's been happening, I mean, obviously, the last year we have seen, as you pointed out, the war in Gaza has expanded, right, to include, conflict in Lebanon against Hezbollah, as well as even direct strikes between Israel and Iran. Where has China been in all of this? Virtually non-existent. I mean, it's obviously made political statements, it's reiterated its concern, but it's not actually done anything. And also the fact that it's not done anything also, I think, exposes the limits of Chinese influence. It hasn't reined in Iran when it came to Iran's decision whether or not to retaliate against Israeli attacks. I don't think the Iranians ever, or certainly I don't think either the Iranians on one side or the Chinese on the other have ever calculated each other into their own well, neither of them have really included the other side into their calculations when deciding whether or not to attack Israel. So in that respect, I think the Chinese are pretty much redundant from all of this. And I think it comes back to the point I made earlier, which is that it's important not to overstate or inflate China's presence in the Middle East. Yes, it is an important economic actor. It is a major economic actor for all of the individual countries concerned. In most of these countries, China is now its number one trading partner. But that doesn't necessarily. But that economic relationship is not synonymous with a more substantial political presence or diplomatic presence either. And I think even there you have a little bit of an ambivalence on the Chinese side, because I think there is an awareness that the more you become involved politically, you are going to have to make choices. And when you make those choices, that means that one side is going to get favored over another. That means you end up upsetting people. And I think one of China's great advantages over the last 2 decades in the Middle East is that it has avoided having to make those kind of choices. In some respects, that's also been helped by the fact that it wasn't being confronted by the United States. If you go back to the first decade of this century, China, this is the moment at which China's economic activities started to really flower in the Middle East. It also happened at a time when there wasn't that much contest or contestation by the United States with China. And so in many respects, actually, China's ability to build its economic relationships with the region was helped by the Americans providing the security umbrella. I mean, the Chinese would never say that, but they did effectively. The Americans were the ones managing or involved in making these kind of difficult choices, upsetting people, creating rivalries and enemies. The Chinese never had any of that. Now, I think if you're I think we've just alluded to this when we look at the current war in Gaza. So China's. It's quite striking that when you look at China's response to the Hamas attack back in October 7th, 2023, it's because it didn't explicitly condemn Hamas. It was doing it with one eye to the United States. But by doing that, it offended the Israelis. And it was thereby making a political choice. And we see the consequence of that now, which is that the Israelis are not prepared to consider China as a meaningful partner in any kind of peace negotiations if they should ever take place. And I think that is one of the challenges that Beijing faces, which is that, like it or not, their economic interactions with the region are going to require them to play a bigger political role. The problem is, by playing a bigger political role, they are going to end up having to make choices which is going to offend people, just as the Americans do. And that's exactly the thing that the Chinese are trying to present themselves as being the alternative to.
Yeah.
One other thing as well, and I think this is something that's been, this is something we need to consider as we look ahead, which is that China is facing its own particular challenges at home, right? And this actually precedes the COVID pandemic, that China's economy is starting to slow down. Decisions about business decisions are now sort of having to be made in the fact that the economy is slowing down, that there is less capital, there's a lot more policy uncertainty at home, and I think that is going to have repercussions further afield, including in places like the Middle East. It may well be that when the high point of Chinese economic exchange and investment in the Middle East has passed. And it may well be that this discussion about China being a greater presence or more influential actor in the Middle East is really a question of the past rather than of the future.
Yeah, China is facing many like one of the major problem is with Taiwan. Very complicated dilemma which we are going to face in recent years. Because Taiwan is becoming really concerned when it comes to technology and
exactly.
So it's a very complicated dynamic. We will talk about this Taiwan too. So